Ferry passengers criticized him for being overly cautious. They just saw a methodical, slow-moving old sailor. None of them knew that Captain David Wright had spent 25 years commanding the U.S. Navy's largest ships. That stormy night on Puget Sound, the forgotten hero's true abilities were revealed. Welcome to Human Stories. Before we begin this incredible story of hidden seamanship, emergency navigation, and forgotten valor, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor these quiet guardians. Captain David Wright had been working the Washington State ferries for 4 years now, and most passengers barely noticed him at all. At 62 years old, with salt and pepper hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades at sea, he moved through the ferry operations with the measured pace of someone who understood that the ocean demanded respect. To the commuters rushing between Seattle and Bainbridge Island, he was just another ferry worker. The older guy who checked their tickets, helped with luggage, and seemed to take an unusually long time doing routine safety checks. What none of them knew was that Captain David Wright had spent 25 years with the United States Navy, commanding everything from destroyers to aircraft carriers. He'd navigated through typhoons in the Pacific, supervised complex naval operations during the Gulf War, and served as executive officer aboard the USS Nimitz during some of the most challenging maritime missions in recent history. But that was his old life. Now he was just Dave, the ferry crew member who insisted on triple-checking safety equipment and always seemed to be watching the weather. It was a gray November evening, and the 6:30 p.m. ferry from Seattle to Bainbridge Island was packed with the usual crowd of commuters heading home after work. The National Weather Service had issued a small craft advisory for Puget Sound, but ferry operations were continuing as scheduled. Dave was performing his routine pre-departure inspection, methodically checking life jackets, emergency equipment, and communication systems. His thoroughness often delayed departure by a few minutes, which irritated both passengers and some crew members. "Dave, can you speed it up?" called out Mark Stevens, the ferry's first mate, a 35-year-old who had been working the ferries for 8 years. "We're already running 3 minutes behind schedule." Dave continued his inspection without hurrying. "Just want to make sure everything's secure. Weather's building out there. It's just a little wind," Mark replied dismissively. "We've run in worse conditions." Dave looked up from checking the emergency radio. "Have we? When?" Mark couldn't answer that question. In his 8 years on the ferry, he'd never actually experienced truly severe weather. But Dave had navigated through conditions that would have terrified Mark, in much larger ships with much more dangerous cargo. As the ferry departed Seattle's Coleman Dock, Dave positioned himself where he always did during crossings, near the bridge, where he could observe the captain's navigation and monitor weather conditions. It was a habit from his Navy days, when situational awareness could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the ferry skipper, was a competent mariner with 12 years of experience on Puget Sound. But as they entered the main channel, Dave noticed something that made him uneasy. The wind was picking up faster than the weather forecast had predicted. The wave patterns were becoming irregular, and the barometric pressure on his personal weather device was dropping more rapidly than it should have been. Dave approached Captain Mitchell respectfully. "Captain, I'm seeing some concerning weather developments. Winds gusting to about 35 knots now, and the pressure's dropping fast." Captain Mitchell glanced at her instruments. "We're still within operational parameters, Dave. Ferry Command hasn't issued any restrictions. Ma'am, with respect, I think we might want to consider altering course to stay closer to the protected waters near the shoreline." Mark, who was nearby, rolled his eyes. "Dave, you're not the captain. Let Captain Mitchell do her job." Dave nodded and stepped back. He wasn't trying to undermine anyone's authority, but 30 years of maritime experience had taught him to read conditions that others might miss. 20 minutes into the crossing, Dave's concerns proved justified. The wind had increased to 45 knots, and waves were now reaching 8 to 10 feet, unusually large for Puget Sound. The ferry began experiencing significant rolling motion, causing passengers to grab for handholds and some to become seasick. "Attention, passengers," came the announcement over the intercom. "We're experiencing rougher than expected conditions. Please remain seated and hold on to the handrails." But Dave could see something that others couldn't. They were approaching a convergence where wind and current patterns would create even more dangerous conditions. In his Navy experience, this was exactly the kind of situation where routine operations could suddenly become emergencies. He approached Captain Mitchell again. "Captain, I need to recommend immediate course adjustment to bearing 285 degrees. We're about to hit a convergence zone that's going to make conditions much worse. Dave, I appreciate your concern, but I've been running this route for 12 years. I know these waters." "Yes, ma'am, but I've been navigating for 30 years, including combat operations in the North Pacific. That convergence zone ahead is going to create wave heights exceeding our safety margins." Captain Mitchell looked at him more seriously. 30 years? What's your background, Dave?" Before he could answer, the ferry hit the convergence zone. Waves suddenly increased to 12 to 15 feet, and the ferry began experiencing severe rolling that sent unsecured objects flying across the passenger deck. Emergency alarms began sounding as the ferry's stabilization systems struggled to compensate for the extreme motion. Several passengers were thrown from their seats, and Dave could hear the unmistakable sound of someone being injured. Without hesitation, Dave moved into action with the calm efficiency of someone who had commanded ships in far worse conditions. "Captain Mitchell," he said with quiet authority, "recommend immediate course change to 270 degrees, reduce speed to 8 knots, and angle into the waves at 30 degrees off the bow. This will minimize rolling and give us better stability." "Who are you to give navigation orders?" Mark demanded, even as he struggled to maintain his footing. Dave turned to Captain Mitchell. "Ma'am, I'm Captain David Wright, United States Navy, retired. 25 years of command experience, including aircraft carriers and destroyers. I've navigated through typhoons in the Western Pacific and storm systems in the North Atlantic." The bridge went silent except for the sound of waves crashing against the ferry. Captain Mitchell stared at him. "Your Navy?" "Yes, ma'am. Retired 4 years ago as commanding officer of USS Shiloh. If you'll permit me to assist, I can help get us through this safely." Another massive wave hit the ferry, causing it to roll nearly 25 degrees to starboard. Captain Mitchell made her decision. "Captain Wright, what do you recommend?" Dave moved to the navigation station with the smooth confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times under much more dangerous conditions. First, we need to change our heading to minimize the impact of these cross waves. Come to bearing 270 degrees and reduce speed to 6 knots. We're going to ride this out rather than fight through it. As Captain Mitchell adjusted course according to Dave's guidance, the ferry's motion immediately became more manageable. Next, we need to redistribute passenger weight. Most people are crowded on the port side trying to see Seattle. We need to move them to the center of the vessel to improve stability. Dave turned to Mark, who was now looking at him with newfound respect. Mark, I need you to politely ask passengers to move to the center seating area. Tell them it's for their safety. Yes, sir, Mark replied automatically, then caught himself. I mean, yes, Captain Wright. Dave continued his assessment. Captain Mitchell, what's our ETA to Bainbridge at current course and speed? About 25 minutes. Good. The storm system is moving northeast, so we should be able to maintain this heading and arrive safely. But we'll need to be very careful during docking operations. As Dave coordinated the ferry's navigation through the storm, passengers began to notice that the motion had stabilized significantly. What had been a frightening ride was now manageable, even though the weather outside remained severe. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a 68-year-old regular commuter, approached Dave as he monitored the weather instruments. Excuse me, but are you the one who helped get us through that rough patch? Dave looked up from the barometer. Just doing my part, ma'am. How are you feeling? Much better now? That was terrifying for a while. Are you a sailor? I was, for a long time. Navy. Mrs. Patterson smiled. I thought so. My late husband was Navy, too. I can always tell. Thank you for keeping us safe. As they approached Bainbridge Island, the docking presented another challenge. The wind was now gusting to 50 knots, and the dock was experiencing significant wave action that would make the normal approach dangerous. Dave studied the harbor conditions and turned to Captain Mitchell. Captain, recommend approaching from the northeast at reduced speed. The wind and current will push us toward the dock, so we'll need to compensate by angling our approach about 15 degrees upwind. I've never docked in conditions this severe, Captain Mitchell admitted. I have, Dave said simply. May I take the con? Captain Mitchell looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Captain Wright, you have the con. Dave moved to the ship's controls with the fluid motion of someone who had done this countless times. His hands moved over the throttles and steering controls with the precision of a surgeon, making subtle adjustments that kept the ferry perfectly positioned despite the challenging conditions. All stop, he called out as they approached the dock. Port engine back 1/3. The ferry glided into the slip with textbook precision, despite waves that were still running 6 to 8 feet. Secure all lines, Dave ordered as the dock workers caught the mooring ropes. As passengers began disembarking, many stopped to thank Dave personally. Word had spread through the ferry about the retired Navy captain who had guided them safely through the storm. Captain Mitchell approached Dave as the last passengers left the ferry. Captain Wright, I owe you an apology and a debt of gratitude. That was some of the finest seamanship I've ever witnessed. Dave began securing equipment for the return trip. You handled it well, Captain. You made the right decision to accept help when conditions exceeded normal parameters. Why didn't you ever mention your Navy background? Dave smiled. Wasn't relevant to checking life jackets and helping passengers with luggage, but sometimes the old skills come in handy. Mark approached them looking embarrassed. Captain Wright, I owe you an apology, too. I had no idea. No need to apologize, Mark. You were doing your job. But this is why we always do those safety checks, even when it seems like we're being overly cautious. You never know when you'll need that equipment. The return trip to Seattle was made in calmer conditions as the storm system had moved through. But something fundamental had changed aboard the ferry. Dave was no longer the slow, overly cautious ferry worker. He was Captain Wright, the retired Navy officer whose experience and expertise had kept everyone safe. Over the following weeks, word spread throughout the Washington State ferry system about the incident. Dave received official recognition from ferry management and was offered a position as a navigation consultant. But he declined the promotion. I like working the ferries, he told the ferry superintendent. I like helping passengers and ensuring their safety. That's what I've always done, whether it was on a destroyer or a commuter ferry. 3 months later, Dave was conducting his usual pre-departure inspection when a young Coast Guard officer approached him. Excuse me? Are you Captain David Wright? Dave looked up from checking emergency equipment. I am. Sir, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Kim, Coast Guard Station, Seattle. I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy last year, and one of my instructors mentioned your service record. Would you be willing to speak to our junior officers about navigation in severe weather? Dave considered the request. What would you want me to talk about? Leadership under pressure, sir. How to make decisions when conditions exceed your experience level. Dave smiled. The first lesson is this. Never be too proud to accept help from someone with more experience, even if that person is just checking life jackets on a ferry. Lieutenant Kim nodded. Yes, sir. When would you be available? I work Monday through Friday, but I'm free on weekends. Happy to help. As Lieutenant Kim walked away, Dave returned to his safety inspection. He had always been a teacher, whether he was training junior officers on a Navy ship or showing ferry passengers where to find life jackets. The setting had changed, but the mission remained the same. Keep people safe and get them home. Conclusion. Some people retire from the military and spend their time reminiscing about their glory days. Others find new ways to continue serving, using their hard-earned skills in whatever capacity they can help others. Captain David Wright never needed anyone on the Washington State ferry system to know about his 25 years commanding Navy ships. He wasn't looking for recognition or special treatment in his ferry job. He was simply continuing to do what he'd always done, using his expertise to keep people safe on the water. The navigation skills were still there when they were needed. The leadership was still ready to emerge in a crisis. But most days they were content to ensure that commuters had a safe, routine trip across Puget Sound. Real leaders don't stop leading when they change uniforms. They just find new ways to serve. Have you ever discovered that someone working quietly around you had extraordinary military or professional experience? Someone whose hidden expertise surprised you when it mattered most? Share their story in the comments below. And if stories like this remind you that heroes work quietly among us, subscribe to Human Stories. We're here to honor the everyday guardians who continue serving long after they've hung up their uniforms. See you in the next story.